This is an interview on the 29th of April 2004 with Captain Alan Watson-Moore, 39th Battalion, B and D Companies, 12 and 18th Platoons. First of all, Alan, how did you come to join the 39th Battalion?
Well, that was rather an interesting story because what I really wanted to do was join the AIF, but I was underage, and in those days we had to get parental consent if we were under 21. And as I'd lost my only sister, my parents weren't keen for me to go into the AIF. So when I left school cadets, I went into the 14th Battalion Militia, which was a militia unit at the corner of Punt Road and Commercial Road in Paran, and was doing universal training with them. Having been a cadet lieutenant at school, I was very quickly made a junior lieutenant in the 14th Battalion, and we went into camp and out again on 3-month stints. That would have been in 1940, in the early part of 1941, looking after universal trainees. Then we got information about a battalion that was being formed to go for tropical service. No further information than that, just tropical service. And a number of us who were still under 21 and still respecting our parents' wishes found out that we could transfer from one militia battalion to another one by applying for a transfer without telling mum and dad. And I was intelligence officer in the 14th Battalion at that stage, and I applied for a transfer, and I understand I was one of the first young lieutenants accepted for the 39th.
So how old would have you been?
Oh, I would have been coming on 20 at that stage. No, I might have been 20, round about that mark.
So in fact you were a Choco soldier?
Well, you can call me that if you like. I was a militia soldier.
And why were they nicknamed chocolate soldiers? Part-time?
Well, the AIF thought they were superior because they had volunteered for overseas service, and militia soldiers were enlisted to defend Australia and its territories, which meant they couldn't be sent outside the immediate Pacific zone. And the AIF boys thought they were very superior because they could go all over the place, and I think they had all sorts of funny stories about us melting if the heat was on and things like that. But Choco was a name that was widely used and continued right throughout the whole war.
What do you remember of the camp at Darley?
I remember Darley as a fairly comfortable military camp. In our earlier militia units, we'd been living in tents at Mount Martha or Seymour. When we got to Darley, we lived in very comfortable huts. We had very good cookhouses and very good food. And really, as a campsite, it was superior to anything that any of us had ever encountered before.
Did you actually sleep on the floor, or did you have a stretcher?
I had a stretcher. I think most of the officers had stretchers. I think most of the boys were on palliasses on the floor, but that was common throughout the army. There were certain privileges.
Oh, they probably deserve it. How much training did you do at Darley?
We did a lot of training, but it wasn't of much value. The officers training us there were First World War officers who'd been in the Darley area training AIF reinforcements, and all the training was aimed at open warfare. Open warfare is all very well, and training for it, I guess, was a fit and proper thing for those who were going to the Middle East. But in our case, it proved to be absolutely futile, and whilst many say the 39th Battalion were untrained troops, I don't really go along with that. I think we did have reasonable training, but it wasn't the right training for where we were going.
So you would have had rifle training, map reading?
Oh, all the things that one would normally do were long route marches to get fit, rifle training, practice throwing grenades. which of course were just stones. They didn't have any grenades for us to work with. Map reading, no. Map reading would have got down to the NCOs possibly, but not much of that, I'm afraid. We did a few night exercises. We did one very big exercise called the Battle of Corangamite, which took us through the whole of the Western District. I think if you read back through a few old GGs, you'll find that I put a story in about that one. It was quite a farce. No one knew what they were doing or where they were going. But we did have to sleep out for a few nights and live on iron rations, so I guess that was part of the training.
When the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor in early December, were you told you'd be going overseas?
No, we weren't, but we had enlisted in the we had volunteered in the 39th Battalion to go somewhere overseas, so we did expect to go, and by that stage the word had got around that our job was really to replace the 49th Battalion, that's a Queensland unit, which was already doing garrison duty in Port Moresby. And I think at the time we were shipped away, that was still the intention, but that didn't work out that way.
So you're all loaded off on 2 troop trains to Sydney to board the Aquitania that was at Woolloomooloo Wharf. That's
right. It took us, I think it was the best part of 3 days to get from Bacchus Marsh to Sydney by train. Goods trains always took preference over troop trains, of course, so you were pushed into sidings quite a lot. But we ultimately got through Central Station and down to a little railway station near Woolloomooloo. And from that we were put into ferry boats and shipped out to the Aquitania, which was, I think, fairly close to Garden Island at that stage, a little bit down the harbour. And as a matter of interest, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the Aquitania, and 3 battleships were all in Sydney Harbour at the one time, and you could hardly see the water.
That would have been pretty amazing. What did you remember about the journey once you set sail on the Aquitania?
Oh, there's not much to remember, really. We had good food. The troops were in a fairly uncomfortable situation. A lot of them were below waterline. They didn't have all that much room either. The officers were a bit better treated. I spent the journey in the Aquitania's honeymoon suite with 14 other young subalterns. And I drew a short straw and slept on the floor.
And did you have any entertainment, or did you just, sit on the deck?
Oh, we did a bit of boat drill and things like that, and a bit of rifle drill, but really it wasn't a very long journey, and we were also new to being at sea and busy looking for sharks and things and looking for submarines and so on. It all seemed to go fairly quickly.
I suppose the morale would have been fairly high.
Yes.
A lot of the troops, their age was only 18 and a half, or, young boys, and it would have been their first trip anywhere.
Oh, yes.
Overseas.
That's true, but I think it is wrong when it's stated that the average age of the 39th Battalion was 18 and a half to 19. In fact, I'm quite sure that was wrong. There was one platoon that had an average age of 18 and a half to 19, but I think the true average age would have been nearer 21.
That's fair enough. When you arrived in New Guinea, can you describe the scene and how you unloaded?
Oh, yes. I can remember it clearly. The first thing was the Aquitania ran aground in the Port Moresby harbour. They'd never had a ship that big at Port Moresby before, and there we were, I guess 300 or 400 yards out from the wharf, stuck, churning up mud. They decided to take us off in anything that would convey troops. We had to walk down the gangplank at the side. I came off in a corvette, others came off in in PT boats and things like that. But by the time they unloaded the 4,000 troops from the Aquitania, and the tide came in a bit, they were able to float her off and get away. 4,000 troops would have weighed quite a lot, I think.
So when you were unloaded, where did you think you were going and where did you end up?
When we were unloaded, we didn't have the foggiest notion what we were doing, nor did anyone else. We went ashore at the Port Moresby wharf jetty, which we got to know very well later on because we unloaded so many ships there, and we were met in company lots by one representative of the 49th Battalion, who was to guide us to our bivouac area. I might add at this stage we were carrying our full kit too, and it was fairly heavy, and it was a very steamy tropical night, and in our case the 49th Battalion guide, wearing shorts and short sleeve shirts and looking pretty fit, he marched off and we followed him for 7 miles.
So where did you end up?
We ended up on the slopes overlooking the 7 Mile Drome at Port Moresby, and were told by our 49th Battalion guide, that is your area, and then he vanished. And we had nothing. We didn't have food, we didn't have mosquito nets, we didn't have anti-malarial equipment, we didn't have ammunition, although we wouldn't have needed it at that stage, but we did have our rifles and Bren guns and anti-tank rifles that we'd carried all the way out there to the 7 Mile Drome. We did not have shovels to dig latrines. In fact, we didn't get them till about 4 days later when they came out of the bottom of the hold of one of the cargo ships. And we just camped on the side of that hill that night and were all eaten alive by mosquitoes. And within a few days, we had our first malarial cases.
Would have been pretty miserable those first few days.
Those first few days were almost impossible. We did get a little bit of water for our water bottles. Eventually they got off a water cart, which went around the companies, and that water cart was driven by Jack Wilshire, who you will be interviewing in a short time.
What was your first job at the 7 Mile?
Our first job was protecting the 7 Mile Drome.
Even though there was nothing there to protect?
There was nothing there to protect, but it was thought that there would be, and we were set up in company and platoon positions all around the Drome. In most cases we mounted our First World War worn-out Lewis guns on tripods and had them all around the Drome, and with them we were supposed to protect bombers at 17,000 feet if they came over. It was a fairly fruitless arrangement. That was our main job. Our next job was unloading ships. Our next job was building roads. Our next job was digging defences, which we did many times on every occasion when someone decided that the last lot were in the wrong place.
So you would have shifted around a little bit, the camps were shifted?
Oh yes, we were around the 7 Mile Drome basically to protect it, but then companies did move out down the 7 Mile Valley. One company was at Bootless Bay, some of the machine gunners were at Bootless Bay, and we did sort of filter a bit out to other positions around the Drome, but the 7 Mile Drome was still the centre of our activities. So
how much training did your men actually do, or were they mainly used as a workforce unloading the ships and the supplies?
Around Port Moresby there was hardly any training. We were too busy working.
Do you remember anything in particular? Did they have any sort of sports days, or did they have any sort of competitions? I believe there was a competition for a camouflage, to build a camouflage trench.
It wasn't quite that, but that was a bit later on when Brigadier Porter arrived, and he was rather horrified at the defences that had been prepared around Port Moresby, and he set up a competition saying that the section that prepared the best section position would go home to Australia for a week's leave. It worked fairly well. Gee, the boys worked hard on that. They dug trenches, they covered them, they did all sorts of things. That was the competition. The competition was for the best section post. The prize was a week's leave at home.
And did they come back?
I can't answer that. I don't know.
In about mid-February, the first bombs were dropped on Port Moresby and then the 7 Mile Strip. What happened once the bombs started falling in your strip?
Well, once the bombs started falling, it wasn't only bombs landing, because the bombers were always followed in by fighters. So we'd keep down in our slit trenches while the bombs were falling, and after the bombers had gone over, we'd jump up and get behind our Lewis guns, hoping to get a pot shot at the Zeros as they came through strafing. We did knock down a couple of them at different stages, I understand, and one of the sergeants in B Company, Les Martirana, to his dying day swore that he and I shot down a Zero, and to his dying day I continued to tell him that there were a lot of other people shooting at it too.
So did you get used to these bombing raids as part of your daily life?
Well, they did become part of the daily life. I don't think it would be fair to say that you'd ever get used to them.
Mm-hmm. And were any of your men actually killed in those bombing raids? Or were you fairly...
I didn't lose any. We did lose a few on an unloading party on the McDewey one day when they dropped bombs and hit the McDewey. That included one of our lieutenants, Ted Money, who was dreadfully wounded and died the next day.
I suppose you're virtually defenceless, but news was that the 75th Kitty Hawk Squadron was coming to protect you and to offer some fight back.
Yes, well, we heard about the Kitty Hawks coming. They got to the stage of being the Never Hawks. Then they were going to be the Tomorrow Hawks. And one day, 5 fighter planes came in on a low run down the dome in the same manner the Zeros always did. And these 5 fighter planes were unmarked. Didn't have the RAAF roundels on the wings. And someone somewhere opened up at one of them. So we all opened up with our Lewis guns. The whole of the 39th and some of the 49th Battalion were all shooting at our own 5 Kitty Hawks. They were all hit. 3 of them became unserviceable. And then when someone woke up to the fact that they were ours, there was a lot of consternation. One of them took to the air again about half an hour after they landed. It was the one that was least damaged. It was flown by Flight Lieutenant Wilbur Wackett, who was a school friend of mine. And I'd met him before he took off, and he had a lot to say to me, because when they were landing, a bullet had gone through the headrest just behind his head, but hadn't done any further damage. And Wilbur Wackett went up and, in full view of all the troops on the ground, shot down the Japanese reconnaissance bomber. And whereas we'd always spent time in slit trenches when this was on, everyone was standing outside the trench waving their hats and saying, "You Butte, go to it."
I suppose you've thought, at least, you've got something to fight back with now.
Well, that was the start of something to fight back. Progressively more planes came after that, not many for quite some time. And then even later again, the Americans started bringing in a few planes.
Mm. The Americans arrived with their Negro work crews. Do you remember what they contributed?
They contributed a lot of complaining. They didn't seem to do very much work. They ate copious quantities of ice cream from the ice cream machines that they brought ashore with them. They had a lot of things set up to make life easy for them. If we wanted a shower, we'd tip a bucket of water over ourselves. They had engineers come in and build rows and rows and rows of showers and things like that. They were rather spoiled.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could just describe for us your daily routines, like with your meals and your food, what sort of food you had. Did you shower? What sort of facilities did you have?
Oh, look, we had field kitchens. We lived out of Dixies. The food wasn't too bad. it'd come and go, but sometimes you got fairly good tucker and other times there wasn't much. There was a time when we had herrings and tomato sauce for about 5 days in a row, and someone reckoned he'd turned over one of the tins and that they'd been canned in Japan. Whether that was true or not, I don't know, but it was a good story.
And you would have slept in a tent with mosquito net?
We did have tent flyers and mosquito nets at that stage. Yeah. It was at about that time that I left the unit.
Oh, right. Where did you go?
To hospital.
To hospital.
I became one of the worst dysentery cases that had happened around the unit. I was a very, very sick boy, and I went off to hospital, and I was there for quite some time.
And the hospital would have been in Port Moresby?
Yes, yes.
It would have been the 9 Mile or the...
Oh no, I went to the officers' hospital.
Hospital.
If the boys had dysentery, they went to Lightning Ridge.
Yes, I've heard about Lightning Ridge. And I believe about a third of the troops had dysentery within 6 weeks.
Yeah, that's right. But some had bad cases and others had curable cases. I happened to have a very bad one, and I was away for quite some time. And when I came out of hospital, they decided that I wasn't fit enough to go back to the unit. I had to be given a staff job for a while, and I became Camp Commandant at New Guinea Force Headquarters. Now, what my job was, I don't know, and what I did was very little.
Well, at least you're honest about it.
I had a desk, and I used to shuffle a few papers around, and I don't remember very much more than that. I used to even be able to borrow a utility occasionally and drive down to the 39th Battalion and see my friends. But I was in New Guinea headquarters for quite some time and didn't rejoin the unit until after the Kokoda Track campaign. After the unit came out at Kokoda and were resting at Hombrom Bluff, that was when I rejoined the unit. So other things that happened during that period before action, I could only relate what I've heard other people say. I wasn't involved with it.
Well, everybody's story is different, and it's good to get a good perspective on everybody.
Every story will always be different, I'm sure, because we're all over 80 and our memories aren't that good.
Well, when you did see some action, did you know you were going to be sent to the north coast of New Guinea?
Oh yes, yes. The unit did some reformation and reforming and training work at Hombrom Bluff, and we got a number of reinforcements while we were there, and did a fair bit of route marching and things to get fit again. And we were then moved down into the 7 Mile Valley, fairly close to the Drome, in preparation for going over the Owen Stanleys and back to the North Coast campaigns. We knew we were going there. Well, I knew we were going there. I guess everyone else did. But there was no secret about it at that stage. And I was 18 platoon of D Company at that stage. And at that point I received a few reinforcements from the 53rd Battalion, which didn't impress anyone very much at all after their record up round to Sharaba. I could, I think, refute some of the things that were said about their troops. A few of the boys I got from the 53rd were very, very good soldiers and did a great job up around Gona and Amboga River area. I think the 53rd was, well, very unfortunately, they were all shanghaied into the job. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't have final leave. They didn't have anything. And I think their resentment became apparent in their reactions. But also I think that their officers were those that militia units around Sydney didn't want. They got rid of them by sending them to the 53rd. And I think the officers were poor, but I think the troops would have been as good as any Australian troops.
That's fair enough too. So where did you first go to see your first action? And how did you get there?
Righto. Well, from the area around the 7 Mile Drome where we were all stationed at that point, we all flew platoon at a time from there to Papua. Now Papua was get what we'll say a day's march inland from Gona, and a few of the AIF units had been battling like mad to retake Gona unsuccessfully, and there'd been terrible casualties there, and we were shipped over, and the first job we were given was by order from General MacArthur to take Gona by frontal attack.
And when would have this been, Alan? About November or?
About November, yes.
42.
Yeah, about that, yeah. 2 platoons of D Company did the first attack, 16 and 17. I was in reserve because I was inexperienced, so they kept me out at that stage. And that, of course, was a terrible failure. They were decimated, and apparently the hierarchy back in Australia was so annoyed about it all that they ordered that there would be another frontal attack the next day. Now, that was when our wonderful CO, Colonel Ralph Honour, found a way of disobeying orders without it being apparent that he was so doing, and took the time to do a little reconnaissance and found out that there was no hope of taking Gona by a frontal attack, and he organised to do it another way. Now, right at that very point, I was sent with my platoon right up to the Amboga River, which is about 2 or 3 miles, which direction am I in? West of Gona. There'd been a small party there. Hattie was the lieutenant, he was 2nd 27th. Hattie, he'd had a small party there holding a position on this side of the Amboga River with the Japanese just on the other side, and they used to do a bit of sniping at each other. And he was known as a standing patrol, and I was sent there to be to replace him in the standing patrol, which I did. We were there for a night, and that was a very hairy night. A Japanese landing barge came up on the beach right beside us, and we were told we were there to observe, not to start anything fancy. I always believed that I might have let the show down a bit at that stage. I should have disobeyed orders and ducked down and thrown a couple of hand grenades into it, but I did as I was told. I was there as an observer, and we just observed. But the landing barge went off again and went in further down the beach. And I completed my 24 hours there, went back to the battalion at Gona, and my platoon was supporting Kelly and Hugh, what's his name?
Delby.
Hmm?
Delby?
Hugh Dolby, yes. The 2 Hughes were putting in the final attack on the right flank, and my platoon was in there supporting them. And that's where I got mixed up on things to some degree for the first time.
That's it.
Now, after Gona fell, the situation at Hattie's village had changed. The Japanese had come across the river. This was the morning after my group pulled out, eliminated Hattie and his patrol, and occupied that area, and our battalion was sent around to retake the Hattie's village area. We didn't go along the beach, along the coast, because we would have met opposition there. We went well inland, through the jungles and swamps, right around, and approached down the Amboga River to Hattie's village, where we made contact and probably were involved in one of the fiercest fights that the unit was in its history. My platoon was given the job of cutting right through on the left flank and severing their supply line. I lost 2 of those very good 53rd Battalion boys going in there. One of them was hit in the spine and the other one in the leg. Both damn good soldiers too. But we did get through to the beach. I was able to cut their supply line and their telephone line. And when they tried to reinforce along the water line, my platoon had the distinction of cleaning up about 15 of them. the fight for Hattie's village lasted for several days in the worst conditions that we ever encountered anywhere. But we did succeed in that one. And Julie went back towards Gona and were then told we were going to Sanananda where there was another scrap on.
So how long would you have been in action in the Gona area?
Was I in action?
The 39th?
Oh, look, that's a question I'd find difficult to answer. Several weeks. Several weeks. It was weeks, yes.
And how did you get supplies up there?
Carriers. Everything was carried. There was no other way. And native carriers did a very good job. Good supplies were landing at Papua, and at that stage they did have a few jeeps there which were bringing supplies up the rough track from Papua, close to the, close to the fighting areas. And supplies were improving all the time when we were there. I think high echelon had learnt that we couldn't fight without equipment. By that time we had replaced all our First World War weapons with modern weapons.
And how did the wounded, how were the wounded evacuated? Did they have to go back over the track or did they go back by...
Oh no, the wounded were walked out under escort if they could walk. If they could walk with someone on either side of them supporting them, they went that way. If they couldn't, they went out by stretcher, carried by native carriers, and that was back to the casualty clearing station, which was close to Papua Airport, and from there they were flown back over to Mortley, to the 9th AGH.
So after your action there at Gona, you flew back to Port Moresby?
Oh, no. No, after the action at Gona, we went to Huggins Roadblock at Sanananda. And we were there for another week or two. We didn't move much there, it would seem. If you put your head up, someone had a shot at it, and if you looked up to have a shot at them, there was usually someone got in a shot before you did.
Were the Japanese dug in?
They were both dug in and in trees as snipers. They were very good snipers from trees and camouflaged themselves very well. But the Huggins Roadblock wasn't a very pleasant situation because we just lived in mud. If you wanted to get below ground, you had to scoop out a bit of mud and lie in it, which we were doing most of the time. But again, at Huggins, we suffered quite a few casualties too. And our numbers were going down and down and down all the time.
And how did you manage to sleep?
Very seldom. And then just in, snatched a half hour here or something and there, something like that. Generally speaking, you'd be in a position for a day or 2 days, and you'd be relieved by another platoon who'd move into that for that period, and you might be out for a day, something like that. But at Huggins, we were hardly ever out of the line. We seemed to be going most of the time. But it was from Huggins that we ultimately came out of the line 7 officers and 25 men strong.
Out of the whole battalion?
Out of the whole battalion. And if I'd lasted another week, it could have been 8 officers and 25 men.
Well, you all would have been totally exhausted, mentally, physically?
We were exhausted in every way that you could be exhausted. But physical state, I think, was the big problem. There were very few who felt that they could stand up and fight at that stage. It had been going too long.
What sort of state were your clothes in and your personal hygiene? You wouldn't have been able to wash or shave or...
No, we hadn't washed anything for a long time, I can assure you. Remembering, though, in that North Coast campaign, we did have jungle greens, long trousers and long sleeve shirts, which the boys didn't have at Kokoda. They were in shorts and shorts.
And had they dyed your uniform green to blend in instead of khaki?
Well, they issued us with jungle green uniforms mostly, and did give us some bundles of green dye that we'd put in 4-gallon buckets and boil up and throw our clothes in, and they came out of beautiful camouflage too, the different colours all over.
Did you, when you were up there, did you have any sort of communications? How did you manage to communicate with Port Moresby? How did you know where to go? Did you have maps?
There were some maps, but they were very, very primitive, and they never seemed to get down below company headquarters level. Communication was probably always the biggest problem in New Guinea. As a platoon commander, I probably wouldn't know what the next platoon to me was doing, or where they were for that matter. And communication back to company headquarters was by runner. If you could kid someone to get out of your slit trench and go back, it wasn't nice getting out of slit trenches and being a runner. They shot at you. So communication was always a problem, and the only time there was good communication was when we were out of the line and something was being planned. In the line, it was hopeless.
How did you feel when you first saw the Japanese soldier?
It's an unusual question, isn't it? I think the attitude was, he's trying to kill me, so I've got to try and kill him. I don't think we had any feelings for them at all. The first Japanese that Harry Mortimer's platoon encountered at Oibi were the Imperial Guard, and they were all 6-footers. And big, strong, highly trained, healthy men. Later in the campaign, some of those we encountered were the little fellas with a lot of gold teeth that we thought all Japanese were going to look like. And they weren't as robust, but they were just as tenacious as soldiers, though.
So eventually you went back to Port Moresby?
Eventually we went back to Port Moresby. I went back in a hospital plane, as practically the whole unit had done, because, as I said earlier, there were only 7 and 25 left. So
you all flew back instead of...
The 7 and... Oh, yeah, all flew back from Pop and Daddy, yes. Yeah. Oh, yes, there was no movement across the Owen Stanleys at that stage. It was all by plane.
And most of you would have ended up with malaria or tropical diseases, dengue fever, etc.
I think that malaria would have occurred almost without exception. I did meet one character who claimed that he'd never taken the quinine or the Ativan. He'd always managed to dodge doing it, and he never got malaria, but I found it hard to believe. Most of us took everything we were given and still got the problems. I said, when I came out of the line, I had a bit of a bullet graze on the back of my leg, but that was nothing. It wasn't enough to keep me out of action. But I had malaria, dengue fever, and hepatitis.
So you would have ended up in hospital?
Oh, I was in hospital for 3 months.
At Port Moresby?
At Port Moresby, yeah.
What was the hospital like there?
Oh, excellent. Excellent. The 9th Australian General Hospital was a tent hospital. Big Indian tents, they called them EPIP tents. I don't know what that stood for, but a number of them connected together in a row and very well set up, and the nursing staff were great. And
I believe it was just a dirt floor.
Yeah, I guess it was, yeah. I was in a ward. I had Sister Reed looking after me. I remember her name. She was very much older than most of the other sisters there, but she was a dear old girl. She really was. And I had one of my lifelong friends, he's still a lifelong friend of mine, was in the ASC down in Port Moresby. And he heard that I was in hospital, and he came up on a motorbike one night and he got behind my tent, and underneath the tent flap he put cans of asparagus and all sorts of fancy things. I guess they'd been designed for the General's mess, because they were not the sort of food that anyone else saw. But he put all sorts of fancy things behind my bed, including fresh oranges too, behind my bed. And dear old Sister Eve got hold of all this. And she said, I'll look after it for you, dear. And I remember she came in the next day round about lunchtime and said, what shall we have for lunch today, dear? Some asparagus?
He's probably sharing it.
Look, she was marvellous. Most of them were. There were a few old battle axes amongst them, of course.
And I suppose you're happy to get letters from home and...
Oh, well, at that stage, the mail communication was quite flowing quite freely. There was no problem with it then.
And your family would have been pleased to hear from you back in Melbourne.
I guess they were, yeah.
Mm. So, did you end up coming back to Australia on leave when
Yes.
the 39th came back?
I came back with the 39th, or with a number of troops of the 39th. We didn't really come back as a unit. We came back in dribs and drabs. But I came back. We came down to Melbourne for 2 weeks leave. I think it was 2 weeks. We tossed for who would remain behind in Melbourne to round up stragglers, and I won the toss. And I was on leave for the best part of a month. I had a ball.
That sounds good. Well, you probably deserved it anyway.
And we then went back to Wandekla on the Atherton Tablelands, where we were starting training again with very reduced numbers, though. We were less than half a battalion, I would think. And it was there that we were called on parade one morning by Colonel Ralph Honour and told that the unit would be summarily disbanded and that we would be dispersed amongst other units as reinforcements. Nearly all the troops, not all of them, went to the 2nd Battalion, and the officers were spread around a bit. I finished up in the 2nd 6th Battalion with Bevan French and Ron Plater, 2 other 39th officers.
So how did you feel when the unit was disbanded?
Oh, look, we were terribly upset. Our unit had built up a record equal to none. No unit in the New Guinea campaigns had done more than we did or been as successful as we were. And Ralph Honour really felt it. He almost cried when he had us on parade, telling us that it makes a noise, the clock, doesn't it?
That's fascinating.
The other one will go next. He almost cried when he was telling us this story on parade, and he pleaded with us to all take off our colour patches because he couldn't countenance any member of the 39th Battalion being told to remove his colour patch.
Mm. He sounded like a really fine man.
He was wonderful. He was a compassionate man, a superb tactician, and he got on with everyone from the highest to the lowest.
So after you had your leave, Alan, what happened then? Did you end up going back into the... You went back into the 2nd...
I went into the 2nd 6th Battalion, and where I was a platoon commander for a while, then I was a Company 2IC, and we went back to New Guinea for the ITP WEWAC campaign. And I managed to go through the whole of that without suffering any more illnesses or any serious problem. And at the end of that campaign, I was promoted. I was a Captain Company Commander.
And did you see much action in that campaign, or was it mainly defensive? By that time, the Japanese wouldn't have been
they did
prolific.
They didn't have the same resistance that they'd had previously, but there was plenty of action, but it was more a patrol campaign. We patrolled from one ridge to another, and we'd knock them off that one and move forward, and then have to patrol to the next ridge and knock them off that one and move forward. I didn't like that campaign at all because I felt it was so unnecessary. The war had moved further afield, and I was always hesitant to commit troops to action where I thought we might have casualties. We had to do it as we were told, but I didn't like doing it. Nasty campaign.
Who are some of your colleagues that you can remember?
In the 39th Battalion, Oh, well, most of my friends were other young lieutenants, of course. Judy Garland was one. Well, he was the next platoon to mine in B Company. Then there was Jim Stokes, who was another one in that company. The next one was Fred Males, who was also in our company. In A Company, Bob Sword, who was killed at Gona, and one of my closest friends, and Roy Neal were both friends of mine. Sorry Sorensen in Machine Gun Company was a friend of mine. If you'd given me notice of that question, I'd have quite a few more names, but that's a few to go on with.
So what did you remember of Captain Sam Templeton?
I thought of Sam as a friend of mine, actually. Sam was a very good soldier, possibly a bit too good in that he tried to do everything himself. He was very, very protective of his troops. In fact, I think he probably did more for his troops than he did for himself. He endeavoured to look after their personal affairs as well as their military affairs. He endeavoured to always be fair, and he was very fair, and he was very, very careful about being a good guide and mentor for the boys. He was a good soldier and a good bloke, but one of these people, it might have been a little bit difficult to get very close to him. I spent a short time as his acting 2IC in Port Moresby, in a tent with him, and Sam would never say much except at night when the hurricane lantern was doused. And when you couldn't look at his face, he opened up and told me all sorts of things that no one else ever heard. But a good guy and a good soldier. That sums up Sam Templeton.
Excellent. And I just want to reflect on a story that you told us about. What do you remember about an incident that happened at the Huggins roadblock on the Sanananda Road?
Well, this was the incident that happened to me.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Well, we were always under pressure to push forward. And it was pretty difficult to push forward there because you were grovelling in mud and there was no cover. But I had orders from Captain Bitstrup, my company commander, to do something about pushing forward, and I stuck up my head to have a bit of a look around, and a heavy-duty machine gun opened up at me. And I went flat on my face in the mud behind a little tree stump that was probably 8 inches wide and might have been a foot high, but that was about all. And I was down behind that, and the little Japanese gentleman on the dookie fired off a whole belt of ammunition, which was knocking little chips off the top of this stump directly above my head. Wasn't a very nice situation. Don't ask me if I was frightened. The answer is yes. Scared as I could be. But I had a platoon runner, Charlie Notley. Interesting character, Charlie. Wonderful man in action, absolutely hopeless in a standing camp, always drunk, always AWL, always punching someone or doing something wrong, but in action he was great. And while I was behind this stump with chips being knocked off, and a voice behind me was saying, "Are you right, boss? You okay there, boss? Have they got you, boss?" And he always called me boss. In action, he might have called me sir when we were out of action, I don't know. But when there was a bit of a burst, a break in the firing of this machine gun, I felt myself going backwards. And Charlie Notley had crawled out of the mud hollow that he was in. He'd got me by the feet and he'd pulled me backwards, and he slid me all the way back to join the mud hollow with him. I'm forever grateful to him.
No, that's a great story. So where were you when the war finished?
I was at it was the 2nd 6th Battalion in the Prince Alexander Ranges, or might have been the Torricelli Mountains. They were one blended into the other, at an area known as Kaboybus. I was very glad it finished because my company had orders to do a long-range patrol the next day. It was a matter of about, I would think, in a straight line, 3 or 4 miles over a number of ridges and through valleys and so on, some of which we thought to be defended. And my company had to do a company fighting patrol through to take a position there which was thought to be fairly heavily fortified. We made lots of plans and were not going to sleep that night. But at about, I suppose, 10 o'clock that night, I got a message through on the field phone: cancel tomorrow, the war's over. My company sergeant major Noel Bissett beside me, and he was an elder brother of Stan Bissett, so well known in the 2nd 14th Battalion. Noel was beside me, and I told him. He let out a yell that I think every Japanese within half a mile would have heard. And the word went round the boys very, very quickly. But that's where I was when it finished.
So how long did it take for you to get back to Melbourne?
I guess, well, we all went back to Wewak then, and we had a campsite on the beach at Wewak in very comfortable conditions. We returned by whatever transport was available according to a numbers system that was worked out, and that dated from when you enrolled or when you enlisted, how many days overseas service you'd had, and all that sort of thing. And of course troops got preference and officers went last. So we were on the beach at Wewak for quite a time. You want to be told a naughty story about that?
Of course.
Well, our battalion up in the Prince Alexander Ranges had left B Echelon back on the coast, and B Echelon collected the alcohol supply for the officers' mess for, I think it was about 8 months. And it was a bottle of spirits and a bottle of sherry and a couple of bottles of beer and a few bottles of liqueurs and things like that. And that was for about 30 odd officers. And when we ultimately came out, there were 14 of us left, and there was this massive officers' mess grog supply. So we set up our companies in tents, and we put the company sergeant majors in charge, and we got a little bit busy on the liquid supplies. And we drank our way through the beer, of course, in no time, and the whiskey and the gin came next, and then the sherry, and then all the odd things. And we'd drink till we were silly and just fall in the water and have a swim and cool down a bit and come out and have some more. It was degenerate, really, but the war was over. And one morning, he was Major then, Bevan French, who came from the 39th Battalion. Major Bevan French and I walked into what was supposed to be our mess hut. It was just a tent flap and a bit of a bench, and there was a sergeant appointed as mess steward. And Bevan looked at him and he said, "What's left?" And the fellow behind the bar said, "1 bottle of creme de cacao, sir." And Bevan raised his fist and he slammed it down on the bench and he said, "2 large glasses."
Good story. So you were back in Melbourne shortly after that. Did you get a boat back home?
I came home on the Shropshire. We sailed into Sydney Harbour with tugboats and, squirting water everywhere and flags and whistles and goodness knows what. We were given a wonderful reception coming back into Sydney Harbour. The war had been over for about 3 months at that stage, but they still gave us a great reception. And from there we got on to trains to our various locations, and I came home to Melbourne.
Right. And what do you think is really important for future generations to remember about the New Guinea campaigns?
That could be answered in a number of ways, but I think the thing that must always be remembered is mateship. Possibly above all else, because with mateship, everyone supported everyone else. In military terms, I would say the most important thing is communication, because we lived through terribly bad communications. And the other thing that I think is terribly important is that something should be done about the teaching of history in Australian schools. At the moment, history isn't even taught as a subject. It's combined with other things like geography and something else, and the likelihood of school children nowadays learning anything about the Kokoda campaign is almost nil, except that a number of schools are promoting treks to Ishirawapa every year, and we were very lucky to have 12 school children who trekked from Owens Corner to Kokoda last year, marching with us in our group on Anzac Day. And through the Reverend Roger Wilson at Mentone Grammar, I have an arrangement that this will continue every year. So education about the Kokoda campaign is filtering through.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, on behalf of the 39th Battalion Historical Committee, we'd like to thank you very much for your time this evening, and your words will go down in history.
Well, I think it's been fun because I've enjoyed your company.
No, it's been great. Thank you.